Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Ethical Storytelling 101, Protecting Identity and Integrity. My name is Bradley Martin with Kindful, and I'm so excited today to be joined by Madison Gonzalez, who's going to be presenting our webinar today. Before we get into it, and while we let a few other people join, I did want to give a couple quick housekeeping notes and just a little bit of information about today's session and what you can expect. So first off, this session will be recorded today, and we will be sending everyone out after later this afternoon or at the latest tomorrow morning, the full recording of the webinar in addition to the slides. So you don't feel like you need to take feverish notes throughout the presentation, or if you see anything that you'd like to share with a colleague or board member or something like that, you'll be able to do that. In addition, we do like to keep these presentations as interactive as possible. So we would encourage you to ask questions throughout. We probably will save most of those questions just to make sure Madison is able to get through her whole presentation to the end. But if you'll ask questions throughout, then we will make sure as we go that we I'll try to find themes in the questions, and we'll make sure we try to get as many of those overarching questions answered as we can. So again, looks like quite a few people are joining. Excited to have you. Madison, I'll let you take it away from there.
Thank you much. I'm so grateful for spending the next hour with me. I'm really excited to present this webinar. I think it answers a lot of questions that I get on a lot of my other presentations, and just with working with nonprofits on storytelling. These are some themes that come up again and again, and so I really hope that we're able to address some of these for you, and I make this time worth your while. So a little bit about me. Let's see if I can. There we go. My name's Madison Gonzalez. I did want to share my face with you today, but my camera wasn't working. So, we have some battles with technology from time to time, and I'm sorry that it can't be a little more personal, but that is me. I'm the advancement director at an organization, a nonprofit in Indianapolis called Morning Light. Morning Light serves the terminally ill with nowhere to go and no one to care for them, so hospice patients in their final days. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, as it is pertinent to my journey with storytelling and how I got started in all of this, and why I'm so passionate about it, and why I'm excited to share some of these things with you today. So before we get into that, let's talk about the agenda. What are we going to cover today? I'm just going to kind of introduce you to storytelling and why storytelling is so important. As nonprofit professionals, we should be sharing stories. They are so important for communicating our mission. There are a lot of questions that people have on story when it comes to, identity, not being exploitative, and so we're going to address all of those later too. But first, I want to teach you, how do we share stories for impact? How do we package a good story that makes a difference and really changes minds and opens hearts and gets supporters for your mission? So I'm going to teach you a little bit about storytelling structure and how we do that. Then we're going to get into how to protect that anonymity and identity for those people that we serve, how to avoid exploiting their stories, and then how to promote equity and inclusion through story. Then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A, and I'll do my best to answer the questions that you have. So, intro to storytelling. Why is story important in the first place? Story is evolutionary. So before, we had formalized communication, our ancestors told stories. That's how we pass things along. So our brains are actually hardwired to connect to and absorb stories. And when you think about it, we've been listening to stories and digesting stories from childhood with bedtime stories and movies and shows and all of that. Our brains literally connect to story in a way that other forms of communication just can't touch. So we look to story to learn from others successes. What have people done right? What can we learn from? And then what can we avoid? What were some of the mistakes that other people have made, so maybe we don't have to, mimic those same things? We also look to story to connect to each other. We look to story to feel something, emotionally, and to grow, to expand our, perspectives and our paradigms. And without story, we are all reduced down to, facts and data and figures and timelines, and we lack that context. So story has a way of sticking with us. We remember stories better than we remember other forms of data. This is a picture of the Abby Hunt Bryce home, and this is the home that Morning Light operates in Indianapolis. So like I said, we serve the terminally ill with nowhere to go at the end of life. And this is the beautiful home. It's a 12-bedroom home where they can come and stay for free, receive care and, compassion, and most of all, dignity in their final days. And this home and the people that have lived in it are instrumental for why I believe story is so important, and really how I came to find the power of story. So when I first joined Morning Light, I realized that the individuals that we serve were in a very interesting time in their life, right? They were aware that they only had a few months left to live. And it became a very reflective time for them. And they were very eager to share their knowledge and share their experiences and share their insights. And a lot of them didn't have family to, pass their stories down to. They had lost their homes. They had lost their family or their support system for one reason or another in many cases. And they lost their health at this point, but they still had these incredible stories. And stories are just one of those assets that doesn't depreciate, right? We always hold on to our stories and we can pass them along. And a lot of people in the home didn't have someone to pass them along. And we realized that. And so we wanted to give them a chance to leave a legacy, right? And so we started collecting and sharing the stories of the people within the home with the public and with our donors and through our communications. And we're just really shocked by the results. So first, I want you to meet this man named Richard. This is Richard, and he was a resident of the Abby Hunt Bryce home. He lit up the halls in 2018. And Richard was a lover of funny t-shirts. You can see his lime green tank top here. He always had something interesting on. But this was our Christmas in July party that we host every year. And he loved milkshakes and ice cream. You can see a bowl of ice cream there. And really, he just loved making others smile. And Richard had a hard life, starting early in his childhood. He grew up in a rough part of town with what he described as an impossible to please father, who was very hard on him. And his need to belong and his tough childhood led Richard to sneaking sips of his parents' adult beverages as early as 6 years old. This would ultimately lead to a serious alcohol addiction and a liver cancer that would cost him his life. Richard was incarcerated. He was married and divorced several times, and he actually lost both of his children before he decided to become clean on June 10th, 1999, which is the date that he, describes as his birthday. That was the decision that he made to change his life. That's his real birthday. That's when his life began. And after choosing sobriety, Richard dedicated his life to helping others do the same. He used his experiences to make a difference. He joined Alcoholics Anonymous and became a sponsor. He spent his time volunteering at a local alcohol and drug addiction treatment facility. And even after receiving his cancer diagnosis and learning he only had a few months left to live, he never touched alcohol again. Richard came to live at the Abby Hunt Bryce home in March of 2018. And while his early life was characterized with addiction, with loss, with pain, he ultimately decided to change his life to begin serving others and made it his mission to make others smile. And ultimately what Richard was doing is using his story to make a difference. While at the Abby Hunt Bryce home, Richard kept a journal by his bedside, which he later gave to us and donated to the home to record his final thoughts. And Richard's final entry read, "Too many of us leave this world with our stories untold." And that was his final passage. And that just really stuck with me. It impacted my life. It's impacted and why I'm so passionate about stories. And when you think about it, even though he passed a few years ago, Richard's legacy still lives on through story. And that's why I believe story is so important. Not only that, stories have benefited our residents in terms of, that ability to leave a legacy through their experiences and insights, but it's also, benefited Morning Light, not only from learning from these individuals, but from being able to package our mission in a really powerful way so that we can impact more people. And when we switched our messaging from, here's what we do, which is, hey, we serve the terminally ill homeless, to here's who we are. We're Richard, we're Osceola, we're Dewey, we're Dixie. These are the faces, these are the names, these are the people that really embody what we're all about. We noticed a huge change in our support. So I mentioned, I met Richard in 2018, and he inspired me to kind of, adopt this new storytelling form of communication. And our donations increased 35% the following year. And I believe this is because people connect to people more than they connect to concepts, right? They connect to individuals. Story is a show and not tell form of communication. So you're able to give your mission some context, and you're able to give it an identity when you're telling stories. And the good news is every organization has a story because every organization has people involved. If you have a person involved, you have a good story. And so now we're just going to talk about how we are able to package these stories to really be effective, and then also how to do it in a very ethical way. So we're going to get into the structure of storytelling. There are some key ingredients that every good story needs, and these never change. And there's also a 3-act story structure, which I'm going to walk you through, that is a very easy blueprint to follow and something that you can just implement again and again whenever you are trying to share a good story. So the key ingredients for a story: you need a character, so the who. You need a conflict, which is the what's going on. Every good story has a struggle, right? Nobody wants to listen to a story about someone who was born and then everything went perfectly and it was all sunshine and rainbows, and then the story is over, because that just isn't really relatable. I don't think anyone has ever been born and have everything go perfectly. So we're looking for that conflict because struggles make story relatable. And then we're looking for the goal. So why is this important? What is the character trying to accomplish? And why should the audience care? And then change over time. So what is the result of the story? So a little more in depth. When we're talking about a character, I recommend the singularity effect, which is just picking one face of your story. So just one person for each story that you're going to share. When you think about it, most major stories and really popular stories, and just stories in general, we typically follow one character or hero, right? We follow Harry Potter, we follow Luke Skywalker, we follow Ebenezer Scrooge. We're following, one person throughout, and of course there's other characters involved, but we want one main focal point. So who is the story about? Think about who embodies your mission. Who, has your mission been able to serve and really make a difference in their life? And then think about how you can make them relatable to your audience. So find common denominators. Common denominators for my math people, you know what those are. They're the things in common, right? They're the bottom lines. And so what you want to do is communicate your characters' likes, their dislikes, their experiences. What have they been through? Where do they come from? What little details about them can you share to make them more human? And not only that, but maybe help your audience relate to them, right? So, you know, with Richard, he loved ice cream. I told you about that because who doesn't love ice cream? You know, he's a human being, he's a person. And, you know, what kind of things can you, you know, communicate to your audience to really tie that humanity together? Conflict. Okay, so like I said, what, you know, every good story has a struggle. So what struggles is the character facing? You know, they can be big, they can be small. In a lot of cases, there's multiple struggles, right? I mean, when we talk about, you know, the struggles that our residents faced at the Abbey Hunt Bryce home, a lot of the time it wasn't just one thing that happened. It was a accumulation of things that happened that led them in that situation, that they found themselves in that situation. So, you know, kind of sift out those struggles and communicate those. How did this conflict come to be in the first place? You know, give some backstory and some insight into that. So a little more in depth, you know the struggle. Here's some different kinds of struggles that characters might face in a story. You have character against nature. You know, maybe there was, you know, a hurricane or a tornado that impacted this character. Character against another character. This is common, right? I mean, a lot of people find themselves in tough relationships. Character against society. Character against self. Character against health, character against technology. I think a lot of us can can relate to this one, especially in the past year during the pandemic. I'm sure technology has worked against us a time or two. I know it's working against me today, not being able to turn my camera on, but we have, you know, character against technology and then character against time. So just think about those things as you're crafting, you know, what that you serve, what is goal? What are the characters' hopes and motives? And why is this important to them? The more you can communicate the why someone should care, the more you're going to be able to invite that audience in, right? So what would it mean if the audience, or I'm sorry, if the character achieves their goal? And then why should that be important to your audience? And then the change over time. So what is the result of the journey? Was there a physical change that occurred? Was there emotional change that occurred? Maybe it was a change in circumstance. Maybe it was a change in perspective. Maybe it was a change in environment. You know, there needs to be some kind of change because the audience is really looking for a lesson learned or a takeaway. So what was the whole point? Why did you just share this story with me? You know, what can it teach me? What can I learn from it? And we can communicate all of these things, the character, the conflict, the goal, and then the change in the 3-act story structure. So first we're going to go through the 3 acts and then I'll walk you through what that looks like and I'll apply a story to it. So hopefully we can tie this all together and have it make a little more sense. So Act 1 is your setup. So this is where you're going to introduce the who, the what, the when, the where, the why. You know, you're setting the scene, you're introducing that character. You're painting a picture of normalcy. So what does life look like before the story takes place? What's the starting point? And then this is really important. Every story needs an inciting incident, which this is what piques the interest of the listener or the reader and really sets the story in motion. So what happens that the character goes, okay, something's got to change? Or what, you know, happens to the character where something starts to change, right? Act 2, we have the confrontation. So this is the rising action. So after the inciting incident, then the story is really going to pick up. And this is where we're going to communicate those goals and the struggles, where we talk about conflicts and obstacles and risks and, you know, are there dangers involved? What's going on with this character? How is the tension building? And maybe how are things working against the character, but also how is the character pushing back? Where is that resilience showing and that determination to meet that goal? And then Act 3 is the resolution. So we have the climax, right? The peak of the story, that aha moment. So we answer any of the questions that were raised in the beginning during the hook and the introduction. And then, of course, that change, right? What was the point? What was the lesson that was learned and what circumstance changed? This is where we communicate that. So for my visual learners, this is my sad drawing of a story structure, but this is as good as it gets for me. I'm definitely not an artist, but hopefully it helps to give you a little bit of a visual of what a story structure looks like. And so I'm going to walk you through this, but instead of using a little girl with a dress and some hair, I'm going to walk you through this with the story of the Grinch, because I think the Grinch is like the optimal story for story structure. And I love the holidays, so let's just bring it around, even though it's been, you know, a few months since December. So let's set the scene of the Grinch. So we have the Who. And we actually have a whole ton of Who's because we're in Whoville, right? That's the where. So we're in Whoville, but there's one main Who of the story, and that's the Grinch. Then the what. Remember, the what is going to be your struggle, right? So what's going on? Well, the Grinch hates Christmas, and really know why he hates Christmas. Maybe his shoes are too tight, or his heart is too small, but he hates Christmas, and that's just, and he lives up on Mount Crumpet, and he's angry all the time. And the inciting incident that occurs is what? Christmas is coming. Oh no, we have to do something about this, right? So we're going to go into the struggle part of the story a little bit more. We're going to talk about the conflicts and the obstacles. Well, the conflicts are, I hate Christmas and it's coming. The noise is coming. I can't stand it. You know, I don't like it. So I'm willing to take risk to steal it. I'm going to steal Christmas. And it might be a little bit risky. It might be a little bit dangerous. I have to hatch a plan. I have to come up with how I'm going to do it. I'm going to be Santa Claus, and I'm going to dress up like him, and I'm going to go. And not only is this a struggle, you know, that's rising for the Grinch, but we're fearful for these poor Who's who are about to, you know, have their entire Christmas stolen. And, you know, he meets Cindy Lou and, you know, has to lie to her. And all of these things are going as we're going up the story structure. And then he pulls it off. He steals everything, and he goes back up to the top of the mountain, and he's going to dump everything. And right before he does this, the crisis occurs. And if you think about a lot of your favorite stories, or just most stories in general, typically we have, you know, a lot of rising action, a lot of struggle, but then there's this crisis, and this is like that rock bottom moment where it just doesn't seem like anything could get any worse for the character, right? Like everything is going wrong, but then something has to change, right, to get us to like through that climax and the resolution. So the crisis for the Grinch is that he's pulled this off, but then all the Who's wake up that morning and they sing anyway. And Christmas is here anyway, and he cannot figure out how all his hard work was in vain. You know, how is this happening? But then the climax, that aha moment, that you know, that occurrence, the epiphany happens, right? So he realizes that Christmas perhaps means a little bit more, right? And it's not about the stuff and all the, you know, fluff and trimmings of the holidays. It's about being together. And this epiphany causes him to have a whole change of heart, literally. His heart grows, you know, 3 sizes that day. And he decides that he is going to go down the mountain. So we're literally going down through the resolution, right? Down the mountain to return all the gifts and all the things. And when he gets there, he's welcomed by the Who's, and he celebrates the holidays with them for the first time. And he himself, you know, the Grinch, carves the roast beast. And yes, I've seen this movie 100 times and read this story to my kids 100 times. I know this story pretty well. But we have to think about, you know, how did the character or situation change? Well, the character changes because his heart grows and he has a new outlook on life. And the situation changes because now he is actually celebrating with the Who's instead of, you know, standing on the top of his mountain being cranky. And so what's the point? Well, the takeaway for the audience is, maybe we need to back up a little bit around that time of year and not get so wound up about all the stuff, right? It's about, the spirit of the holidays. And I think that's what Dr. Seuss was trying to communicate to all of us. So now you know the structure. I'm going to give you 3 secrets of storytelling for impact. And I don't really know if they're secrets. I just like being elusive, but there's certainly 3 top tips that I find help a lot when it comes to storytelling. So we have secret number 1, which is to know your audience. And this is just a marketing truth across the board that, really stands the test of time, that you have to know your audience if you want to be successful at marketing. And storytelling is really just a form of marketing when it comes to, what we're trying to accomplish in terms of, gaining awareness and gaining support, right? So repeat after me. I have to know my target audience if I want to be successful at storytelling. Identify who it is that you want to tell a story to, and it might even help you select which stories to share in a certain situation, and then how to package those stories to make them relatable to that person, right? So are you communicating with donors? Are you seeking, investments, the public? Are you talking to your brother to get him to come to your event? Maybe a politician to, try to change a policy? Knowing your audience is just going to help you know better how to connect and relate that story to them. And then I love this. I am super nerdy when it comes to like psychology and brain science. And there's a lot of science that backs up what goes on in somebody's brain when they are sharing a story. And so I'm going to try to break that down for you. The science tells us that when we are telling a story, and then even when we're listening to a story, our brain is producing chemicals. So there's an actual physical reaction that's going on. And these are some of the chemicals that are produced, and a good story will produce all of these. Okay, so dopamine is the first chemical, and this is the interesting stuff, right? So this is what's going to make your audience sit up and pay attention to your story. It's going to hook them in. So stories with, good hooks and twists will help, get your audience to pay attention. You want to find something that piques their interest early on. Cortisol. We don't always love cortisol really, but it is helpful sometimes when it comes to a story, because this is where you're going to communicate that struggle or intensity. This is the stress hormone. Your brain is telling you to, right? There's something to be learned here. There's a struggle going on. You don't want to overdo it with cortisol. Otherwise, you just, might come on to and make your audience uncomfortable. We want to communicate the struggle, but we don't want to live there, right? We don't want to spend the whole time talking about the hard stuff. We really want to get to the resilience and the overcoming part of the story. But the cortisol does help your audience, pay attention and learn something. Oxytocin. This is the bonding stuff. So oxytocin is pretty cool. It's actually the hormone that floods a woman's body after she's given birth. So you can imagine how powerful this stuff is. It helps bond, right? So you want your audience to be bonded to you, right? You want them to be loyal. You want them to be good supporters and pay attention and, eat up everything that you're offering, right? And so we want to offer stories with authenticity and emotion. And that might mean getting a little bit vulnerable at times, because the human experience is vulnerable, but it helps to create that connection. So what stories do you have that can, provide that authenticity and then also peak emotion for your audience and induce some emotional response? And then we have endorphins, which is the feel-good stuff. And endorphins, they're the stuff that's produced when we exercise and when we go for a run and we have that runner's high after. Endorphins are, what's produced when two friends are sharing a laugh and having a good time. So, stories that have something somewhat comical or unexpected or, warm and fuzzy, but, really you're trying to kind of create a little bit of comedic interest if you can. And it helps your audience feel good. And, everybody wants to feel good, right? So if you can combine, dopamine, cortisol, oxytocin, and endorphins, you'll have a captive audience ready for action, and good stories can produce all four. We want a captive audience ready for action, and then we want to have a call to action. So, you're missing an opportunity if you don't have a call to action at the end of your story when you share it. You want to invite your audience on the journey with you and make the audience the hero of the story. You may have heard this before if you've attended other storytelling webinars or just any kind of donor communication, right? The donor is actually the hero. So, you want to communicate all the good work that your organization is doing. But you want to frame it in a way that says, thanks to donor support, we were able to do this. Thanks to community contribution, we were able to do this, right? Because what that's doing is it's framing the message to invite the audience to become that hero, to take an active role. They're listening for how they can be involved and how it's relative to them. Don't assume that your audience will know what you want them to do. And also don't give them too many options. Only one or two clear calls to action only, because a confused mind won't make a decision. So how many times have you opened an email and then it's like, you can click here, you can click here, you can click over here, and you're like, well, I think I'll just click the X because that's too overwhelming for me at the moment. You really just want one call to action. So, end your story with a question. Like maybe you want to do a donor survey and you want to learn more about them. So is there a question that they could partake in? Maybe a next step, like I want to click through to a website, or, click here to watch the video, click here to sign up. Or maybe it's an ask. Maybe it's a solicitation and you want that donate now button. But give tangible results. So what does that action result in? And that especially is true with an ask, right? You want to give them those tangible 5 or something, equals a meal for someone, a hungry family. Show them what their money is buying. I love this quote by Joseph Campbell. It's one of my favorites because it really illustrates the point I'm trying to make. When an audience listens to stories of ordinary people called to great things, it helps confirm the belief that we can also become heroes in our own lives. So a story calls people to take action because it might inspire them, it might educate them, certainly entertains them, but it does more than that, right? It starts to get the wheels turning as to how they can be an active participant in their. People aren't listening to your story, they are listening to how they can relate or fit in. So that's where action comes in. And that's why you want to make the story relatable, right? They're really listening. Whenever I've shared a story, and even when I was sharing a story to you, I'm sure, subconsciously, you're going, okay, but what does that have to do with me, right? So that's just kind of something to keep in mind. Now let's get into the ethical storytelling part of the presentation. So this is where a lot of those common questions and concerns, I hope, will be answered. So we'll start with avoiding exploitation. So a lot of organizations are posed with these common concerns. I don't want to seem like I'm using someone that we serve. I don't want to seem like I'm using them, right? And isn't it too personal to ask someone about their life and then share it, right? And even if, even if it's not you that has these hesitations, you might be running up against other staff or board members or other people in the organization that go, I don't think that's right. And here's how we can start to overcome that obstacle, because we really should be sharing stories. First of all, this is just the basics, right? Make sure to get written permission or consent. So we are going to ask people before we share their story. We're not going to share stories without people knowing about it. And not only that, we want to get written permission so that that doesn't come back to bite us later. Nobody wants a lawsuit. So really err on the side of caution, right? When we're posting on social media and posting on websites, sending out newsletters, you need to ask yourself, did I get permission to share this story? And written permission if possible, right? So this goes for visual storytelling too, which is, photos that you might take of people, videos that you might take of people. I really recommend, or not even recommend, I urge you to Google photo consent and release forms. There's a bunch of free ones that you can get online, and print a stack and keep them handy at events or interviews. A lot of the time when we're acquiring these stories, we will interview people. We will say, hey, your story has really inspired me. Can I ask you a few questions about your life so that I can communicate that to others and hopefully, make a big impact? And chances are good they'll say yes, but you want to get that, written or that signature is what I'm trying to say. So keep them handy at events and interviews, and then keep them on file for later. And then when it comes to the visual storytelling, again, make sure to get written permission or consent, but use your own photos. Don't steal people's photos. Don't steal other organizations' photos. Don't steal other event photos. Just, if you hire a photographer, make sure you have the release on all of that. Just, cover your back a little bit. And every state has a little bit different laws in terms of what can be shared. So I urge you to kind of do a little bit of research on that, but I would just hate to see any organization get in trouble in this way. So, use free stock photos if you have to. Repost and share tagged photos. They've given you permission by tagging you. And then event photos are typically fair game. So if you're hosting something public like a walk or, a gala or something, that's typically fair game to post on your social later. Now that we've got the legal, if there's, kind of some mental blocks in terms of sharing these stories, I urge you to consider this paradigm shift and maybe share this with the board or anyone who has some hesitation on this. But psychology actually tells us that storytelling can be incredibly, therapeutic for people. You may be the only one to ever ask someone for their story. You may be the only one to ever take interest in their life. And once again, we're asking them first, right? We're asking them if it's okay to get to know them a little more and then share that story. But telling one story can help them find their voice and gain confidence. It can help them learn that their experience could help another, and that's huge. It helps them make sense of their life's events and experiences. So what are the common threads? What led to what? It's really, important that people are able to identify these things because it helps them make peace with their story overall. Ultimately, when someone shares their story and knows that it could help raise awareness, increase donations for an organization that, has helped them and that they're passionate about, or inspire others, then suddenly their struggle has meaning. Suddenly their struggle has meaning, right? There was a point because now they can use that struggle, just like Richard did, use something that they've struggled with to help others. So I just invite you to give them that opportunity and give them that chance to make that difference with their voice. You have, as as a nonprofit, you have the ability to give that person a platform. And I don't, it's really not up to you whether or not they want to use that platform, right? It's their decision. So you might be robbing them of an opportunity by saying, oh, I don't want to, I don't want to ask too many personal questions. I don't want to get into their life too much. I think society a lot of the time, it teaches us not to do that. Don't overstep the mark. Don't, ask people these vulnerable questions, but you may find that people are really eager to share their story and honored to do so. So that's where the relationship comes in a little bit. And then, of course, once they've agreed, you've gotten written consent and you've held that interview, it's really important to preserve the integrity of that story. So, preserve the integrity of the story means that you aren't changing things. You're not leaving important parts out to make it sound more dramatic or, better serve your organization. You are telling the story as it was told to you. So you can do this using quotes, from the person. I mean, take really good notes, use facts from the story, use testimonials as much as possible. Can you get their story firsthand? You know, if it depends on where you're trying to share your story, but are they willing to share on a stage at your next event, or, you know, on a webinar if you're hosting a virtual event, or in person? You know, I mean, if not, can you record a video? Can you get a video of them, you know, sharing their story and then put that into your presentation? You can even share those videos on social, in your emails. But if, you know, firsthand isn't possible, and it is your job to write and share the story, then try to tell it as it was told to you. So as the storyteller, it's not our job to try and doctor the story, right? So make sure, again, I just want to urge you to take good notes when you're talking to someone about their life. Do this test. Ask yourself, would I be happy listening to the story while sitting next to the person it is about? And if you feel a little uncomfortable, then maybe go back and ask yourself why you feel a little uncomfortable. But, you know, whenever possible, have the individual be an active part in the storytelling process. So if you've written a piece about them, send it to them and ask them, you know, did I do your story justice? Is this okay? Okay, protecting anonymity. This is a big concern for a lot of organizations too, especially when it comes to healthcare or working with children or working with, you know, people who don't want their identity shared for one reason or another. So how can I tell stories if I work for an organization that requires anonymity for those we serve? And how can you connect donors and supporters to your mission if you can't say names and show faces? And this is a big roadblock for a lot of people. So I want to give you a couple techniques that I have found to be effective, and hopefully you can, you know, test out and see what you think. This one's very tried and true. You've probably heard this one before, but you know, tell an inspired by a true story. You know, names and details of the story doesn't change the, you know, it won't strip the storyline, right? That same kind of story that we've identified, that struggle and that goal and that change doesn't change just because you can't communicate the character. So you can still tell the audience about common experiences of those you serve. And I think that they even appreciate it when you disclose, you know, to protect our, to protect the people that our organization serves and protect their identity. We've had to change the name, but, you know, let's call this person Sarah, and, you know, she is a mom from this situation, and here's her situation, and then you can go into the story. So what was the common struggle? What did they overcome? And then how did your organization help? Share stories of people within the organization. So volunteers, right? Staff, board members. These are all people who have great stories as well. And, you know, I think a lot of the time we get very hyper-focused on those that we serve. But, you know, sharing the stories of the people who are, you know, in the trenches is also a really good way to communicate your mission. This can also, you know, boost morale internally because it helps people within the organization feel seen and appreciated. So if you do a volunteer of the month, if you highlight a staff member, if you highlight a board member, you know, you're helping to really validate their work and their life. And chances are great that, you know, that volunteer has a good story too, right? Maybe they experienced something similar to the people that they're serving now, and they're paying it forward. Maybe, you know, someone's an empty nester and their life didn't feel like it had a whole lot of meaning at the time before they found your organization to get involved with. You know, they really feel rejuvenated again. You know, our organizations serve in a multifaceted way, right? Like, you know, it's not just about the people who benefit, but there's a lot that goes on for the people within. So, you know, why did a staff member get involved in the first place? What's their backstory? You know, how has the organization helped fulfill the goal of a board member who wanted to be more involved? You know, board members can really offer some great insight as well. So if you can't share necessarily the people who, you know, you are serving, just, you can still give your organization a name and a face by sharing some of these other options. which can still be really powerful in connecting the public to your mission. I love this one because it's a little bit out of the box. Do you have a physical space? So a lot of might have a clinic or a shelter or a school. And I urge you to share, behind the scenes photos of this physical space. If you cannot share stories of people, show your audience where the magic happens, because people can still feel connected. It's still a visual that you're giving them. So the ways that you can do this is through like a tour. If you went on Facebook Live or something and said, hey, we're going to take a tour of the facility today so you can see where all the good stuff goes down, right? You can share before and after photos. These are really popular, especially on social. So your organization might actually help, renovate homes for people, or, Habitat for Humanity, build physical spaces. Maybe it's gardening, maybe it's the environment. What are some before and after photos that you can share of the physical space? And then share what I call stills with stories. So, you might share a photo. If you are a shelter, for example, you might share a photo of the bed with the teddy bear on the bed and say, this is the bed where someone can sleep safely every night, where an 8-year-old boy can sleep, safe and sound thanks to your support, right? Or, maybe it's an art camp and it's with kids, so you can't share it, but you can share the table and you can share the artwork after and say, this is where, a bunch of maybe, troubled young kids were able to create some beautiful art and express themselves thanks to your support. So this is just another way that you can still tie that audience in and make them feel a part of what's going on. And then I urge you to share quotes. So this goes with and without anonymity. Quotes are great, but you can interview those you serve and get quality, insightful quotes and testimonials without sharing who they came from. So, for example, this is a quote from a terminally ill resident of the Abbey Hunt Bryce home who said, "This place is like home. They treat you like whole people, more than a number." That's a really powerful quote, and I didn't have to tell you who it came from for it to make an impact. And then, okay, so promoting equity, which is so important. First, I want to just give you the definition. Equity is justice, right. Or this is where we really have to do a audit of the stories that we're sharing. Are we getting a full picture of our organization and all the people involved? Remember, people are looking for how they fit into your organization, and people want to be able to see themselves in your organization. And there is a wide variety of, people, right? So we need to be sharing stories from a wide variety of people. Make sure that you are doing your part and getting stories from a wide variety of voices within your organization and from those you serve. So represent different ages, genders, cultures, races, incomes, backgrounds, right? How can we get a full picture? And how can we those within and those that we serve, within the organization and those that we serve have a voice? Ask yourself, when was the last time you got a story from a volunteer? When was the last time that you got you asked your staff for feedback? A story doesn't necessarily have to a full-blown journalism piece. It could just be asking questions, because there's a lot of cases where we just don't know, right? We don't know what we don't know. Nobody knows everything. So, if you feel like you're struggling with a certain aspect of something, ask someone else. And help enable others to share their stories. Ask them for help. Give them prompts. How can you invite people to maybe write why your organization impacted them? Share these things, post these things by inviting your entire constituent base, even your donors. Why do you give? The whole point is really just to try to source a wide variety of backgrounds and insights, right? Because diversity really helps to open minds and shift paradigms and change hearts. And we all are unique and we all have something to offer. And so I just really, encourage you to remain humble on this and honest with yourself on this, and ask yourself, how can I better represent my organization as a whole by asking, important questions of others. And I try to practice what I preach. I share my own story. I share my story through poetry, actually. I wrote a poetry book called Dear Mirror, and I just want to close with a poem that I wrote that's in the book. And it says, "For if we can't chart our chapters and shout them from mountains, then what is the point of reaching the peak? Trust me when I tell you the answers to the questions, who are you and why, are worth the climb." And so I just want to, invite you to share your story. As nonprofit professionals, a lot of the times we look to the left and the right and to those that we're serving to source stories, but you have a powerful story too. You have insights and you have experiences, and you have something to offer others through your narrative, just because you've been alive. You've seen things, and that has value, and you've experienced things, and that has value. And so I just encourage you to, consider what your story is, and look back at your story, and, how you got here, and recenter yourself as to why you're involved with the organization that you're involved with. Stories have a wonderful way of reigniting passion and helping us re-recognize how we got here in the first place, and then where we want to go. I love to talk story, so I'd love for you to reach out to me. I know we're going to get into some Q&A here in just a second, and I'm going to, do my best to answer as much as I can, but you can certainly find me on LinkedIn, and then email me. I've included my email. If you have questions, that we don't get to, or you just want to give me some feedback on what I can do better or what you got out of it, then please reach out. But with that, I would love to get into a little Q&A here.
Awesome, Madison. This has been really, really good. I think as I was listening to you, I always try to, for me, when I watch webinars and things, I always try to. My goal is, if I can take away one meaningful thing, if I can take away two, it was exceptional. But if I can always take away one, and there was something that maybe halfway through that you mentioned about, like, when you're telling a story, you have to remember that, and I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing, but when you're telling a story, you have to remember that the person's not really listening to your story. They're thinking about how they fit into the story. That I thought is, like, so powerful in terms of when you think about how you can relate to your audience and who is your audience when you're telling a story. And it just stood out to me as one of those things that was so powerful. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. I'm really glad that that was helpful. I know that helped me when I heard that. I just try to pass things along.
So great. And then your drawing also, although I agree that drawing's significantly better than what I could draw, but but it was such a great way to kind of visualize what you're trying to explain. So we did have some really thoughtful questions, and so I've kind of grabbed a few. Is it okay if I just start kind of firing those off to you, and we'll get through as many as we can here in the next 5 minutes or so?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll start from the top, and Shelley had, I thought, what was a really good question. That was, how would you respond if someone's story ends up negatively after you tell their story? So, I think there's some fear that, like, if we put a person out there, but then something bad happens, with that person, how do you take down the story? How do you handle that?
Okay, that's a really, really great question. And I think I would want, and if she wants to reach out to me later, like, a little more clarity on what ends up negatively means. I mean, if it means, we just didn't get any good results from sharing that story, and I don't want that person to be embarrassed or something. But, if we talk about negatively, you can certainly take things down, right? I mean, when you put something out there, but I think that we have to consider that that is a possibility, and that person should be aware of that. I think a lot of the time people are hesitant to share their stories because they don't want any negative response. And so, that is a possibility, but it's also just, okay, is it worth the risk? And that's something that that person has to decide. You know, as an organization, it's our duty to share stories, I believe, but that person has to decide um, what they want out of it. I mean, if it means that maybe, you know, a family member of theirs or something reached out and it turned out negatively for them because, you know, they were embarrassed or something, I guess I would just want some more clarity on what negatively means. But communicating that, you know, maybe that is a possibility, but it's also a possibility that you might impact a lot of lives by sharing this story. You know, I think anybody who puts themselves out publicly, you know, anytime you post anything or do anything, I guess there is a risk that there could be some backlash. Um, but I think that's a risk people have to take if they're passionate about their message.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I think you have a great point on what does negative mean. So Shelley, feel free to, if you're still here, feel free to reach out to Madison. Maybe you guys can dive a little bit deeper. So, you know, obviously, you spoke at this towards the end about equity and things like that, but how can organizations showcase a single individual but still convey a commitment to diversity? So that was from Robert.
Yeah, that's a great question too. Um, I think that you don't have to just share, when I say share one story, I mean per uh, communication, right? So per newsletter, per email, you kind of want one focal point. If it's possible to source several different stories, like I know, you know, at Morning Light, we have several different stories that we rotate, and we do try to keep those diverse. I think you can still, you know, communicate that you're diverse in that way. And social media does a really, you know, does us a lot of favors, and it allows us to communicate more frequently than maybe through email or newsletters. So if your social media platform also, you know, just has like diverse language and diverse, you know, hopefully photos and stories of people in your organization. I don't think by sharing one story of someone, um, the recipient would go, oh, they're not diverse. You know, they're clearly just highlighting one story. But if you're consistently highlighting kind of the same profile of person, um, even though they're different people, you're just kind of, you know, highlighting the same profile over and over, maybe consider switching that to how you can be a little more diverse, if that makes sense. Um, but I don't think that people will necessarily jump to that conclusion by getting one story. Uh, I would hope not. I hope that answered that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that was really helpful. I think we might have time for one or two more, but you know, Lauren asked, what would you recommend for storytelling in regards to clients who need to have their identity protected? And I know you've kind of dumped in that, or has spent a little bit of time jumped into that subject, but she said, for reference, we work with domestic violence survivors.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that those inspired by true stories are really helpful. You can even show like photos of like silhouette kind of things. Like, I mean, that could even be a stock photo, but you know, I know there's a lot of silhouette photos of like a female or a male that can still kind of, it has an interesting way of still communicating the humanity of it, if that makes sense. Um, and so, you know, grab a black and white silhouette photo and maybe think about one of the individuals that you've served. And you can change the details, but it's inspired by a true story, right? So I'm guessing that the struggle is the same across the board in a lot of ways. And then the overcoming, you know, how did that person overcome their struggle and their situation? And then how did you help? I think your audience will absolutely understand if you say we have to protect the identity of those that we serve, but we still want you to understand what a day in the life might look like for someone who's encountered that, and then share that story.
I also thought, you know, some of your ideas of using quotes, but anonymous quotes, but saying, you know, from a, you know, from a survivor or something like that, you know, like just having it,
Exactly.
you know, highlight that what the position that person was is. Well, the last one because we've had this from a couple different groups, is that there's some folks who can't give written permission on their own because they're either a minor, or one person mentioned that she works with people in women in middle America who can't read or write. And so in terms of like getting permission from folks to share their story, either if they're a minor or like people who serve underserved youth, or or if they don't actually have the ability to sign a consent, that person asked specifically, would verbal consent be okay? But can you talk a little bit just about permissions and things like that?
Yeah, and this is something that I would love to recommend researching, because I think it's different in every state. So, a Google search on what's required, I think would be helpful. If it's really serious, maybe just reach out and ask a lawyer, because they could really advise you better than I could, to be honest. But I do know that, when it comes to minors, you need to get their guardian's permission. So if their guardian is available to, sign, and that's okay. In terms of not being able to read and write, that's a great question. I really don't want to, ill advise you on that. So I would just recommend maybe doing a Google and seeing what, to be honest, I really don't know the answer to that one. I haven't encountered.
Well, I think that's always saying I don't know is better than giving poor or bad advice, or advice that is ill-advised. So,
especially legal advice. I don't want to ill-advise anyone here.
Yeah. Well, Madison, thanks so much for the time today. We got, in addition to the questions, we got a handful or many comments of just how great this presentation was and how much everyone enjoyed it and appreciated your candor throughout. And so thank you so much for your time. For all those who attended, thanks so much for spending the hour with us and letting us share some of Madison's thoughts. So I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. And if you're in the Southeast by chance, hope everyone stays safe with the storms coming through today. So thanks everyone for your time. Thanks again, Madison.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye-bye.